All right, let's jump right into this. Welcome to This Explainer on Maulana Maududi's incredibly profound commentary on Surah An-Naml. Today, we're zeroing in on a really fascinating concept, how having absolute power reveals a person's true character. I mean, if you've ever wondered how ancient rulers handled just unimaginable wealth and authority, and what that actually tells us about human nature, you are absolutely in the right place. We're going to be pulling insights directly from Maududi's famous commentary, the Tahimul Quran, to unpack this massive story full of miracles, sprawling empires, and honestly, the ultimate test of the human ego.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with an introduction to Surah An-Naml, then look at Moses and divine signs, followed by the kingdom of Solomon, Solomon and the ants, the hoopoe and Queen Sheba, and finally, wrap things up with true power and submission.
Okay, Part 1. Introduction to Surah An-Naml.
To set the stage for everything we're exploring today, Maulana Maududi brilliantly points out in his introduction that this chapter is fundamentally about contrasting reactions to divine truth. The text doesn't just, list off historical events for the fun of it. It actually uses them as specific models to prove a deep psychological point. It's showing us that when humanity is face-to-face with the ultimate truth, people generally split into two distinct camps. And that split, it's based entirely on their character and their ego.
And this perfectly captures that core narrative arc. On one hand, we have Pharaoh, a guy who saw absolutely undeniable proof but let his arrogance completely blind him. Then, directly contrasting him, we have Prophet Solomon. Here's a man given power and wealth that literally dwarfed Pharaoh's. Yet he viewed every single ounce of it not as a right, but as a test. Keep this contrast in the back of your mind because honestly, it's the engine driving this entire explainer.
Moving on to Section 2, Moses and Divine Signs.
Let's look at our first historical model to see what it actually looks like when truth is flat out rejected. The text highlights this concept of mubin, which translates to clear, self-evident signs. And we're not talking about vague metaphors here. When Moses goes to Pharaoh, he is armed with actual miracles, like his staff literally turning into a serpent and his hand shining brightly. Maududi's commentary really stresses that these signs were so undeniably clear that they left absolutely no room for rational excuse or doubt. None. They were objective realities staring Pharaoh right in the face.
So how does Pharaoh react? Well, despite seeing these undeniable proofs, Pharaoh and his inner circle rejected them with complete haughtiness. This is a super vital point in Maududi's analysis. Their denial wasn't born out of ignorance. It wasn't a lack of evidence. Internally, they totally recognized the truth of Moses' message, but outwardly, they rejected it purely out of arrogance, injustice, and a desperate desire to maintain their own worldly power. They essentially chose their egos over the truth, and as the text outlines, that willful blindness led directly to a disastrous end.
All right, Section 3, the Kingdom of Solomon.
Now the crucial thing here is comparing Pharaoh's arrogant reaction to our next ruler, Prophet Solomon. You know the old saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely? Well, if that's true, Solomon should have been the most corrupted man on earth. He was granted an unprecedented kingdom, literally unlike anything else in human history. He commanded these massive, highly disciplined armies made up of three very distinct groups: humans, jinn, and even birds. Seriously, it's the kind of supernatural dominion that would turn pretty much any ordinary king into an absolute tyrant overnight. So, let's see how he actually handles this level of power.
Which brings us to Section 4, Solomon and the Ants. Just picture this scene for a second. Solomon is marching with this terrifying multi-species military force. As this massive army approaches the Valley of Ants, a single solitary ant issues an urgent warning to its colony. "O ants, enter your dwellings lest Solomon and his soldiers crush you unawares." It's this tiny, almost imperceptible little voice standing right in the path of a marching empire.
Now, you really have to ask yourself, how would an ancient emperor, flush with unparalleled military might, react to hearing a tiny insect? Most worldly kings wouldn't even notice, right? And if they did, they certainly wouldn't care. To a typical empire, the lives of ants mean absolutely nothing.
Maududi spends a significant amount of time in the Tahimul Quran rejecting modern rationalist attempts to sort of explain away this miracle. Some modern commentators have tried to argue that, Valley of Ants was just the name of a human tribe, and the ant was simply a human scout. But Maududi meticulously breaks down the Arabic grammar and the context to assert the reality of the text. No, this was a literal, physical ant speaking, and Solomon was given the miraculous ability to actually comprehend its speech. He defends the supernatural reality of the event because, honestly, it's totally essential for demonstrating the sheer scale of Solomon's divine gifts.
And what is Solomon's reaction to hearing this tiny ant? Instead of boasting about his incredible ability to hear insects or just ignoring the creature entirely, he smiles. He is genuinely amused by the ant's caution. And then he immediately turns to God in a prayer of deep, profound gratitude. He prays to remain thankful for these immense, unimaginable favors and asks for guidance to use his power to do righteous deeds. Just contrast that with Pharaoh for a second. Pharaoh saw a miracle and his ego inflated. Solomon experienced a miracle of his own power and he grew humble.
Moving it right along, Section 5, the Hoopoe and Queen Sheba. So earlier we mentioned Solomon's army included birds, right? Well, the Hoopoe bird, acting almost like a military scout or an intelligence officer, goes missing for a bit, but it returns with what the text calls yaqeen, certain, undeniable news. The bird basically brings back verified top-tier intelligence about a wealthy and powerful queen over in the land of Sheba, whose people worship the sun instead of God. And this kicks off what is basically a high-stakes geopolitical thriller. It maps out a fascinating diplomatic exchange between a prophet king and a wealthy polytheistic ruler. First, the Hoopoe reports the sun worship. Second, Solomon doesn't just impulsively attack, he sends a commanding but principled letter inviting them to submit to the truth. Third, the queen, who is clearly a savvy politician, consults her military chiefs. They immediately boast about their strength, but she prefers diplomacy. So fourth, she decides to send a lavish, expensive gift to Solomon. As the commentary explains, this was a calculated test. She wanted to see if Solomon was just another worldly king who could be bought off with gold, or if he was truly a prophet driven by higher principles.
Which leads us to our final section, true power and submission. Spoiler alert, Solomon outright rejects her attempted bribe. He makes it crystal clear that the wealth God has already given him is infinitely better than whatever she can offer. But he actually goes a step further, to completely dismantle her pride in her kingdom before she even arrives. He asks his court who can bring her magnificent throne to Jerusalem, and according to the text, a person with knowledge of the book teleports her massive throne to Jerusalem in the literal blink of an eye. Bam! It's an unbelievable flex of divine authority that renders all her gold and armies completely irrelevant. And here is the defining moment of the whole story. Looking at this impossible feat of teleportation, an act that would make almost any modern leader declare themselves a living god, Solomon utters these incredibly profound words. "This is from the favor of my Lord, to test me, whether I will be grateful or ungrateful." Wow! He recognizes that absolute power is not an absolute right. It is an absolute test. Every blessing, every ounce of authority, is just a question from the divine asking, will you be thankful or will you be arrogant? As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, defining thought on how you handle the blessings in your own life. Maulana Maududi's commentary on Surah An-Naml isn't just a history lesson from the past, it's a mirror for us today. Look, we might not have armies of jinn or the ability to hear ants, but we all have some measure of power, wealth, or talent. The ultimate takeaway here is simple. When you're granted these gifts, do they inflate your ego like Pharaoh, blinding you to the truth? Or do they humble you like Solomon, reminding you that it's all just a test of your gratitude? Definitely something to think about the next time you find success. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep diving into the depths of these texts. There's always more to uncover.